The Russian invasion of Ukraine is causing big losses, not just to Ukraine but also to Russia. While Ukraine's loss of life and property is obvious, there are growing murmurs about how Russia has already lost this war. For starters, many reports claim that by going to war, Vladimir Putin has tacitly acknowledged that his multi-year policy of coercion and bullying of Kyiv has failed. Russia's hopes of keeping Ukraine in its sphere of influence without the use of military force have also been dashed. And this invasion of Ukraine, maybe it has the backing of historic geopolitical reasons, like many of you have been saying in comments, to justify it, but it is dividing the world down the middle on who is right and who is wrong, and the fact is that there is suffering all around. Now, Indian students stranded in Ukraine due to Russia's invasion are being beaten up by Ukrainian forces, according to many reports, while trying to cross the border and get a safe passage into Romania or Hungary. Some are also complaining of lack of support from the Indian authorities, even as Vladimir Putin is putting Russia's nuclear forces on high alert. On the other hand, talks between Ukraine and Russia has started at the Belarusian border, offering a ray of hope for all this to end soon. But before that happens, Russia is already at the center of international criticism. In a tersely worded opinion piece, a professor of political science at Rutgers University in New York, Alexander Motyl, has enlisted how Russia is losing. He says, until Vladimir Putin launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine on Thursday, February 24th, he was winning his standoff with the West. He had compelled the United States and Europe to take his demands seriously. He experienced the pleasure of being treated as the leader of a great power, and he had succeeded in intimidating the Ukrainians as well as Russia's other neighboring states and the wider world. Now, to solidify his victory, all he had to do was to recognize the independence of the so-called separatist republics in the Donbas region of Ukraine, acknowledge that Ukraine's chances of joining NATO were nil, and continue his creeping subversion of Ukraine in the expectation that sooner or later it would drift back to Russia's orbit. And then he blew it all by invading Ukraine, he says. Overnight, Russia became a pariah state. The West has already imposed a wide range of sanctions, with more expected to come, and its effects on Russia have already started to show. Even as we speak, the Wall Street Journal reports that Russia's central bank has raised its key interest rate to as much as 20% directly from 9.5%, as Western sanctions send the Russian ruble into a nosedive and threaten to batter the nation's economy. The European Union, for the first time, will finance the purchase and delivery of weapons in a show of support for Ukraine. The EU is also banning Russian planes from its airspace. Western governments said that they would cut off a number of Russian banks from the SWIFT network and international payment system. The US, the EU, the UK and Canada also said that they would take measures to prevent Russia's central bank from deploying its foreign reserves to support its currency and economy. Overall, it's not looking very good for Russia, as its ruble and financial markets are hammered by these sanctions. And who will suffer from this? The Russians. Meanwhile, he also says that Ukraine continues to hold its capital Kyiv as its citizens are rallying to defend their homeland. Meanwhile, Germany is rearming to counter threat from Russia. Alexander Motyl further writes in his piece that international opinion has almost unanimously condemned Putin's war of aggression, and thousands of his own citizens have expressed their opposition to the war in demonstrations and petitions. Most importantly, Ukrainians have fought back fiercely. This was something that Putin probably did not expect. In his initial announcement of a special military operation, Putin called on Ukrainian soldiers to lay down their arms, not out of concern for their lives, but because he truly believed they would be happy to do so. But they weren't, and they didn't. Instead, they have inflicted punishing losses on his invasion force and have inspired the world with their courage, he says. The professor says that Putin is now in an unwinnable position. Ukrainians throughout the country, regardless of their language, religion or ethnic background, have rallied around the Ukrainian flag. Tens of thousands have volunteered to go into the defense units. Many more have donated blood. Many others have voluntarily handed over their savings to finance the country's defense system. A historic wave of patriotic fervor has gripped Ukraine. The Ukrainian nation has also been joined by diaspora Ukrainians who are now busy staging rallies and fundraising for their homeland. All these Ukrainians now consider themselves a part of a modern nation that is as diverse as it is united against Putin and everything he stands for, which they say is blatant dictatorship. Ukrainians have demonstrated that they love their country despite all its faults, and that they are willing to sacrifice greatly for it. It's the rise of the underdogs. Also, Ukraine's dramatic show of wartime unity and national strength is exceptionally inconvenient for Putin. Professor Mottl says, in his increasingly unhinged attempts to justify this war, the Russian ruler has claimed to be fighting against a ragtag band of fascists, Nazis, and drug addicts who represent no one but their own interests and their paymasters in the West. As it turns out, Putin has declared war on a patriotic nation of more than 40 million people in a country the size of France. Then, weighing the options for Russia, he writes, his options are now all bad. He further says that Putin could still physically destroy Ukraine and commit a massive genocide against its inhabitants, and I'm saying this includes Indians there as collateral damage as well. But Professor Mottl writes that even the craziest of Russian imperialists would agree that this would be a colossal atrocity in human history. Putin may still try to establish a puppet Ukrainian regime in Kyiv to toe the line, as intelligence reports have long predicted. However, that would mean occupying a huge country indefinitely. This would probably require around 1 million soldiers, all of whom would become targets of a Ukrainian resistance movement that would be sure to emerge. Alternatively, Vladimir Putin could try to work out some kind of a deal with the current Ukrainian administration, but that would mean effectively admitting to his inner circle that his bloody enterprise has actually achieved nothing that negotiations could not have produced at a much smaller cost. He then asked the most fundamental question. So why did Putin act so stupidly? One answer, he says, is that he may have lost touch with reality after hiding from COVID-19 in a bunker for almost 2 years. Well, another is that as an unchallenged boss of Kremlin, for more than 2 decades, his advisors are reluctant to tell him what they fear may upset him. He also says Putin's recent meeting of the Russian Security Council was particularly revealing of how dangerously dysfunctional power dynamics are in Kremlin, with Putin alone on a throne-like seat while his minions sat across the vast hall on wooden chairs facing him like school children. Well, another possibility, according to the professor, is that he has completely bought into the Russian imperial and Soviet historical propaganda narratives that have always looked at Ukrainians as either non-existent or Russia's subservient younger brother. It's quite possible that his ideology has blinded Putin and his supporters to the reality of a Ukrainian nation with its own interests and culture. Putin has therefore lost, the professor declares. He closes his op-ed by writing, Ukrainians will suffer terribly from this criminal invasion, but they will survive and emerge as a stronger nation, a modern nation. But Vladimir Putin, in contrast, faces a far more uncertain future following this senseless war. Meanwhile, Ukraine says that Russian forces have lost about 2,800 servicemen and 80 tanks during their assault on them. Ukraine's Deputy Defense Minister Hanna Maliar said on her Facebook page that the Russian troops also lost about 516 armored combat vehicles, 10 aircraft, and 7 helicopters. So what do you make of this war, this conflict situation, this invasion, and this man-made disaster that is making our worst fears come true? Let us know in the comments. You can of course connect with me on Instagram, on Facebook, and on Twitter. It's @ReviewRon and @Ronak Kotecha on Twitter. We can chat over there like a lot of you are already doing. Like, share, subscribe, and hit the bell icon if you have already subscribed to this channel. But as always, even if you don't do any of these things, thank you so much for watching this one. Please take care of yourself and those around you. Jai Hind.